title for this afternoon section is On the Possibility of a Minimalist Ethics. The first speaker will be Professor Xiaoyu from Peking University. Let's welcome.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you, Professor Wen, and many thanks for the organizing committee of this conference. And it's such an honor today to be invited here to present some of my thoughts regarding the general things of Tianxia and global governance. I apologize for my voice because I just caught a mild cold, I think, yesterday. So there was a sudden change of voice since this morning. I will try to keep my presentation short and brief, and I will leave more spaces actually for discussion. The topic of my presentation today is about the main title is against order, and it has been deliberately to, in a way, to be provocative to take such a title. And I think that's the more personal drive behind this research is this kind of feelings of radical uncertainties. I believe that we all feel more or less nowadays, either by domestic politics or by the global, in a way, disorder that we're currently going through. So this widespread of feelings of unsureness, of uncertainty, is what in a way leads me to reflect more generally on the very concept of order and disorder. And I want to start by quoting the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, who said that during the interwar period, in his prison notes, he said that the old is dying, the new could yet be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear, which I think is a very vivid description of what we're going through nowadays. Many people would call that we're currently going through this painful transition between political orders, characterized by these normative uncertainties. And it's exactly during this transitional period that we have seen that these different proposals, alternative proposals, that try to end this transition period and in a way try to accelerate the passage into a new set of rules and norms. So this is what I call this kind of transitional logic or mentality. And I think behind this kind of transitional mentality, and in a way to close our eyes and hopefully this painful period can be passed very quickly, behind this mentality, some of the more fundamental questions have been neglected. The first one is that how do we actually understand the transition, this kind of interregnum, or this in-betweenness of orders, and whether it can actually be overcome or passed through. So this is the first question. And the second question is that, is there a possibility of co-living with each other if we cannot find any common grounds, neither in a minimalist nor in a maximalist sense, as I will discuss later, illustrated by the idea of minimalist morality and the concept of tianxia. So how do we live in this kind of radical decensus instead of consensus, the radical decensus that is out of order? So those are the two questions which lead me to take a different direction of inquiry in comparison to many of the alternative proposals for orders, for different orders, or for new orders nowadays. A quick summary of the central argument of my presentation is that I believe that the interregnum is not a state of exception that is to be overcome eventually, but it is a state of normality that reflects our liminal and precarious conditions of modern life. So in a way that we always live in interregnum, and this is a constant process of becoming and transitioning that we're going through. And the second argument is that the minimalist and the maximalist approach, which I will explain later, despite their differences in appearance, they all share a very kind of, in a way, like a key common feature, is that they're all consensus oriented and driven by the urge for order. So they're in a way that build around the very concept of consensus. It depends on what kind of degree of consensus they say they can agree upon. So order has been seen in their proposals as a priori, not only as normatively desirable, but practically achievable. And I find this urge for order problematic for two reasons. Now, one is that there's always a debate over the ownership of orders. The questions of whose order and whose consensus can easily slide into conflict, confrontations that destabilize the very foundations of orders. And secondly, is that the orders that which we can see, and especially discussing in these theoretical and textual terms, are in a way floating above or detached away from the everyday life, which we find actually in everyday life, cross-border activities and exchanges occurred with or without the existence of so-called global orders. So even before we start to discuss, about globalization and global orders, transnational exchanges and connections already occur. So how did it occur actually at that time without the formulation of global order or international order? So the question is really that we have managed to live in disorder, so-called disorder, global disorder in the past. So in a way, that's how can we continue to manage to live in the absence of normative consensus? So this leads me to, in a way, to reflect on living in disagreement, and how do we, in a way, provoke or in a way inspire the ethics and practices of convivialist living and collaboration that do not require the pre-assumption of an order. This is not to say that we all live in anarchy, but it points to the realities and practices of dissensus that constantly blur and challenge the existing borders, and lay down the very mechanisms for digesting the differences. So this is what I call the ethics of disorder that can deal with change, uncertainty, and otherness in our time. So this is a very quick kind of run through of my argument in my presentation. And I can, in the next about 4 or 5 minutes, I can go to a little bit more details about the arguments which I would like to elaborate. Now, the first one is about the very concept of interregnum, because when it was used in the past, in the 1920s or 1930s, it was referred to this transitional period. And gradually, starting from the 1990s, sociologists, including Bauman, start to apply it to describe not only the domestic societal transition, but the global condition where the rulers no longer can rule and the ruled no longer wish to be ruled. So a lot of, in a way, the morbid symptoms of our current time, including rise of populism, polarized politics, recessions in internationalism, climate change, and all that, are often be seen as this result of this ongoing interregnum. And this also resonates in a way with Professor Zhao Tingyang's diagnosis of the global disorder, which he called a failed world, which a diagnosis which I agree with, but as we can elaborate later, that's my kind of later subscription or prescription for this kind of failed world actually are actually different. So inspired by the very concept of interregnum and the concept of liminality that's often discussed in sociology and anthropology, what we find is this kind of transitional period actually turned into a more permanent condition of our modern life. So the modern life itself become about identifying and responding to crises and uncertainties, either in individual or collective forms. So that in this sense, society is no longer moving from one specific order to the other, passing through the period of interregnum, but is punctuated in a state of transitioning and becoming without evolving necessarily evolving into a final and stable format. So this is, in a way, what I call what has become permanent, the state of interregnum. And the second point, which I can elaborate a little bit later, which is also related to the ideas I believe that we all try to address for this conference, is the minimalist and the maximalist approach to this transitional period, which I believe that Professor Michael was, his idea represents a minimalist approach, and Professor Zhao Tingyang's idea of Tianxia in a way represents the maximalist approach to the question of interregnum. The difference is there that they assume the ontological priori at different levels. Michael Watts's idea is that the minimalist morality follows this bottom-up approach, which we can assume the ontological priori at the minimalist level. So what can be agreed upon individuals as the minimalist principles that we can work upon or live together. And in contrast to that, Professor Zhao Tingyang's idea of Tianxia assumed that this top-down approach, which takes the whole world or the planet as the ontological priori, to identify what can be agreed at the global level before moving down to the state or to the individual level. So in a way, the ontological starting point of the minimalist and maximalist approaches to different orders are different. But here, that what I argue is that despite the differences, they all share the common feature is that they all argue that we should, in a way, and we can move from the current disorder into alternative orders proposed by different ideas. And regardless of the ontological starting point of the different orders, they all assume that there will be consensus that can be reached upon, can be agreed upon. So this is what I call, in a way, the consensus-based, consensus-oriented proposals driven by the urge for order. Yeah. And why this kind of consensus-based order that are problematic, I already pointed out. One is about the ownership of these orders can always be controversial. And the second is about the relevance of these orders, how those kind of abstract orders can be relevant to the everyday life, to the everyday cosmopolitanism or transnational connections. So that's in a way responding to the very similar question that my proposal is this ethics of disorder, which includes the existing practices and actions that creates the possibility of coexistence without a consensus-based order. It is a form of everyday cosmopolitanism that allows the temporary suspension of moral assumptions and follow the logic of contingence in dealing with this emerging or radical uncertainties and ambiguities in our modern life. And I argue that the true actions of border crossing, either in physical or metaphorical sense, requires this ethics of disorder, because this entails the actions of transgressing that actually punctuated the existing borders and regulations and norms. And I point out these are two practices which we use every day in our daily interaction, are actually central to the ethics of disorder. One is forgetting, the other is doubting. And forgetting and doubting are often discarded as negative qualities in consensus-oriented order proposals. But here I argue that actually forgetting and doubting are extremely important in creating the daily, in a way, communication between us. Doubting is the attitude that it is quite intuitive in the intersubjective interactions, as we should constantly reflect on our own subjective perspective and schemes and existing norms. And by forgetting that, can we actually get into understanding the other's perspective and where the other is actually coming from. And by doing this, we can actually address those kind of ownership of orders, and also about how the ethics of disorder can break down the boundaries between the everyday and the political, because it will emphasize the utility of the everyday practices and actions that all human beings are already employing. So in a way, the ethics of disorder are not proposing or urging people to adopt new behaviors. We're simply saying that we should, in a way, maintaining and amplifying some of the existing practices that we're already doing, but are often, in a way, excluded from the consensus-oriented proposals. And to summarize, that is the main kind of like the point I would like to highlight in this really brief kind of summary of my presentation. But to summarize, I think the ethics of disorder is about recognizing that in a way, there are differences that we cannot, in a way, easily transcend or easily overcome by proposing alternative orders and norms. But paradoxically, it is kind of this radical argument that makes these intersubjective conversations possible, as the deep-rooted conflict arise not from the notion that we are fundamentally different, but often from the questions that why the other is not thinking or acting the same as me. So the assumption of consensus actually can drive us into, in a way, long-term conflict rather than the notion that we are fundamentally different. So to recognize otherness is to accept the necessity of living together with or without consensus. So this is the form of everyday cosmopolitanism on the rooms of this moral uncertainty and precarity and precariousness that we're currently going through. Thank you very much, and that will be the summary of my presentation. And I look forward to your feedbacks and replies. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Liu. And let's take some questions. If you want to raise your hand or you just ask questions. Okay, Dr. Ames, yeah, please.
Yes, Xiaoyu, I wonder if order and disorder is an either or. That in David Wong's paper, he cited Dao De Jing, chapter 49, the passage about Sheng Ren Wu Heng Xin, Yi Bai Xing Xin Wei Xin. That the sages are constantly without a mind, that they take the mind of the people as their mind. And then it goes on to talk about Hunxin, the muddled mind of the sage. And so I think like there's an ambiguity of order. Maybe the idea of order that takes care of both order and disorder is the idea that of course the sage is a metaphor for the Tao, and the Bai Xing are the Wamu, the myriad things. And so maybe the kind of order that is represented by the notion of Tao is itself an unsummed totality of all of the orders of the Bai Xing that constitute a Hunxin. And so that the order is Hunxin, and the individual orders of the people is a second level of order.
Mm. Yes, I'm not quite sure that how I can reply to that in a constructive way. But I think that's the very kind of ideas which I trying to formulate there, is that yes, I agree that the order and disorder should not be in either or, in a way, relationship. And by prioritizing, in a way, disorder, what I'm trying to argue there is actually in the seeming disorder that people trying to point out we're living in, we have already created these possibilities or the realities of co-living. So we are already not in disorder, so to speak. They all paradoxically they has always been order in disorder. So this is what I'm trying to, in a way, put there. So yeah, so I definitely agree that it should not be in either or relationship. And you mentioned about these different multiple layers of orders. And this is the argument which I find, I think, both in Michael Ward's argument and also in Zhao Tingyang's argument, and also in many of the discussions right now going on in international relations about how we can move between different multiple layers of orders. And personally or intuitively, that I always find this kind of multiple layering of orders problematic, because if we talk about multiple layers of orders, there has always been this problem, this issue, this question about how we can move between different scales or different layers. So there's always this issue of the subject, so to speak, or whether that's the order at one layer, either at the individual layer, at the state layer, or at the societal layer, or at the global layer, how we can, in a way, justify the moving up or moving down of the values and norms. And I don't think that the current proposals, which I think that's the ongoing discussion, provide a very convincing argument about the movability of orders and norms. I can understand that how individual norms can work upon or operate among individual levels. But once we argue that, for example, that minimalist morality can move from individual level to the state level or to the community level, I think this is where the problem can arise from. And how can we solve the movabilities of moralities and values? Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any professors will raise your hand or any questions? We have still 6 minutes to go. So maybe, okay, Professor Mueller, you're gonna ask questions? Yeah.
Yeah, if no one else is asking the question, I'm first of all, thanks a lot for the talk, Professor Liu. I sympathize very much with your positions. Just to follow up on Roger's question, it seems to me, at least from my perspective, I see, as I said, I sympathize a lot with your positions, and my own thinking is strongly influenced by the Taoist tradition. And Roger not only alluded, but actually mentioned core passages from the Lao Tzu in his contribution. So I wonder if you see a kind of a Taoist element, which I actually do see in your position, and if you acknowledge this, or if this is just some coincidence.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Mueller. And it was by reading your paper, actually, I started to realize, in a way, that's the similarities between what I try to propose and also what you try to propose, and the connection between that and the Taoist thought. Before that, I did not really identify this kind of clear Taoist element there. But as you said, which I believe you're going to explain that in detail later on in your presentation, the very idea of what you said, the minimalist morality, right? I think it's a very it can definitely resonate what I said about the ethics of disorder. Because I think the assumption of morality or the assumption of norms and orders can create a lot of issues and problems that you have addressed in your paper. Yeah, but to answer your question in a very straightforward manner, no, before reading your paper, I did not really see this clear Taoist element there. But since you and Roger both pointed out the importance of rereading the Taoist classics, maybe it's time for me to go back and to read more about it. Yeah, and I look forward to hearing more about your thought on this as well in your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Professor Liu. And any more questions? If not, okay, Professor Sun Xiangchen, please.
Okay, thank you, Professor Liu. And it's a very interesting presentation and provide us another possibility to understand the minimal morality. But I still some question. Okay, wait a moment. Would you please give an explanation? You say that the radical outreach make the intersubjective conservation possible, but I think it also can make the conflict possible too. So if we want to if we if the otherness make the dialogue possible, maybe presuppose some minimal morality, such as do not fight with others or something like that. So in this sense, we still need someone some consensus oriented morality, and not only the aspects of the disorder one.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Sun, for your question. And I also enjoy reading your paper. And your question, I believe, is also related to some of the questions you try to address in your paper when you're talking about Levinas and the absolute otherness there. What I try to elaborate there in my paper is that, or in my presentation, is about the urge for order, or this kind of strong desire to create consensus is built on this assumption that we should have something in common from the very beginning, and that become the basis. So the others should be able to be accepted or absorbed or understood, so that we can build consensus. But my question would always be that what if that others cannot be transcended in any other way? What if the otherness is absolute? And the differences between me and Levinas following that is that I believe that we have already figured out the ways of living with absolute otherness. If we think about it, like if we think that we already live in radically different moral worlds, it might be difficult to imagine that between human beings, but we manage to live with non-human actors, either with machines we created, or with animals, or with plants. It's difficult to argue that they have a moral world, but we manage to live with them for years, for centuries, for decades. So what is, in a way, the basis of interaction there? How do we actually create this kind of possibilities of living in this kind of radical disagreement, this kind of biological boundaries, which there's no way you can transcend? Because we can say we can empathize with other human beings' perspective. Maybe we can say that we can empathize with the animals' sufferings. but it's difficult to say that we can emphasize with a tree's feelings. Normally, at least in this kind of moral philosophy, we won't really argue that. But the idea is that we have managed to live in a multi-species planet already. So it's not about, in a way, that we should discard that practice. It's really about how do we use that pre-existing practices of living in radical otherness already with other species, and use that as an inspiration to look at the interactions we have with other human beings. So why we cannot accept the fact that people just can be radically different and cannot be transcended, but this cannot deny the fact that we still to live together with them and not in open conflict. So I think that by recognizing that radical otherness, maybe we can figure out different ways or new ways, or institute existing ways of living with radical otherness. So that is in a way, the kind of idea behind that sentence which I quoted from my paper. And I hope that answers your question. But I look forward to hearing your ideas about radical otherness as well.
Okay, thank Professor Liu.